this final panel, we have till about 1:30 when we lose the room. The goal is really to kind of come together and maybe sort of pivot off of that energy and synthesize some of what we heard here at the meeting, but importantly kind of look forward and look both kind of inwards at the field, but also outwards at where maybe this field can connect in other areas. These esteemed panelists are going to kind of help guide the conversation, but it really should be a conversation. And so we would love for you all to interject, throw out questions. We'll start in a moderated way, but certainly if you have a comment that you want to add to the conversation, raise your hands. And I think Roger has microphones and I have a microphone. We'll run those around. We would certainly be glad to kind of focus on maybe detailed questions. If you have questions, we'll leave some time at the end of the meeting, but hoping that the beginning part of the conversation can maybe be more synthetic, big picture, 30,000-foot view on this field before we dive into maybe more targeted questions for the panelists on their individual work. Does that all sound good? So I asked these nice AV techs to put Emmanuel's slide back up because I think it maybe encapsulates a good starting point to a synthetic conversation. You guys all can't see this. So this was the slide and the point that he makes about, one of the things I think that's special about maybe not just sleep, but sort of science right now is that we are at the kind of intersection of these convergent revolutions. The four that he pointed out are neuroscience and animal models, analytics, statistics, machine learning, genetics, proteomics, and of course hardware and tech. I would maybe add to that, and I'm kind of channeling a CZI vibe here. Also, I think there's a revolution going on around kind of the culture of science. Sort of how do we think about open science, collaboration, interdisciplinariness, whatever that means to individuals. And so, thinking about kind of this moment in time and where we are for sleep, I think the ambition is kind of a field that's broad, interdisciplinary, collaborative. On the other hand, I think thinking about the talks over the course of the last 2 days, I think it's probably also apparent that there's still an awful lot of silos and maybe kind of bottlenecks in those silos, but also opportunities in thinking about how we can bridge. I think Jonathan also kind of made this point, how can we bridge between research, basic science, the clinics, and tech? And so maybe I'll start there. So how can we go from, I think, this moment in time where there's a lot of amazing science going on in basic fundamental cell biology, developmental biology, neuroscience, genetics, amazing things happening in the clinics, revolutions happening on the tech side. Matt yesterday told us that we should be thinking about these problems as big data problems, the issue of kind of big data. And how do we take that and where do we go from here for this field? I'm going to pick on somebody to start. Louis, you're a good person to pick on because you're closest to me. What are your thoughts on how to create that kind of a field?
I don't know is the short answer, but it's often true that in new technologies can be truly disruptive and take us to a new level. Big data, I see the real power in it. One of the problems with technological advancements is that people flock to them and then most people misuse them or don't use them well. And so I think it is critically important that there's really integral collaborative work done between people who think about the clinical problems, people who think about the very basic cell and molecular problems, people who understand how to manipulate and analyze big data. So I'm not sure what the answer is, but I think it's a mistake. The NIH often, wants to fund people to flock to new technologies, and then a lot of that resource is squandered because people don't do it well. And so I think truly integrating people from different disciplines and having them working very intimately together is critically important.
I would just ask the audience, actually, what do you need from the technologists, right? What would be helpful in terms of sharing insights, whether it be in machine learning or, in more integrated systems. But, I know from our side, we need things from you. Like one of the things that I've had to learn, not kind of going up through the same academic path that you've had, I've had to have people surround me and say, look, not every article you read is the same. And so I've learned to bring people in. So there's a AI residence program that I'd encourage anybody that's either in their PhD or getting postdocs. So we bring people in to sort of educate us, to give us a sense of like, hey, don't look at that, look at this. This is more promising. And so I wondered what that is for you with technology. In the same way that I've had to partner with folks that have spent their whole career both doing basic research but also evaluating other research so that I don't go down kind of a goose chase. How could we help you not go down sort of these technology goose chases?
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I think, with accessibility of that data would be very important, because with a lot of, the wearables, and say patients were to undergo treatment and, with the fragmentation of care, it is nice to know that, if they had some intervention done or something happens to them or some change, that can be, captured, and that we have access to that data. Because right now it's just, maybe sitting in the server. Who owns that data? How do we manage it? How do patients get benefit from, supplying that data? How do they get real-time feedback of the results that we get from our analysis? I think those are all potentially very, it would be a positive reinforcing loop.
So just adding into what Stanley said, exportability to the EHR, so that when the patient does have something that they feel is relevant for their clinician, that they can easily push that as a PDF or something that can then plug into the EHR system and transfer over, so it can become part of the record rather than the doctor trying to look at somebody's phone. It's just not an effective solution. And also raw data.
Yeah, I want to also talk about the access to raw data, because there are a lot of wearables, but the research community does not necessarily have the access to those data. I'm here. So it would be great if at least part of those data, at least at the summary statistics level, would be made available so that researchers can ask their own questions and develop hypotheses based on those technologies.
Yeah, I was excited to learn about a lot of devices that I wasn't aware of from Jonathan. We used to do a lot of Zio recordings in our sleep and circadian subjects, and then Zio went out of business. You never got back to Zio, and why that happened. But the analytic algorithms were all proprietary, and so that raw data is useless to us now, and we're searching for a good solution. And I take Philippe's point from yesterday that surface recordings is not everything about sleep, but it is still an important a tool that we use until better things are available, and how to do that in large numbers of research subjects I think is critically important. Having good tools, but also access to the raw data.
So to answer Louis, actually.
Hey, I'm sorry. My Center to Zio software was purchased by ResMed and rolled into the S+. So now that's under the Sleep Score Labs. So if you had some Zio stuff you wanted to deal with, you would go through them.
So just to follow up on this, one way to step away from this central nervous system-centric vision of sleep would be from the technology to record more of the periphery of the physiology, because I don't need to look at your brain to know that you're asleep. Okay, so just like it would be nice to have and again in terms of wearable, it's going to be easier. Just record the whole body, and maybe, just maybe, forget for a minute, the neocortical activity and try to redefine sleep without that. And then revisit how much we can integrate of the CNS,
Emmanuel, you had something to say.
No, I think there's two things that are clear, and I agree. That the data availability and the big resources are transformational now. For example, the UK bank we heard it's just amazing. I just love them, because it's just they really change the post for so many things by making that data available. So that's really something that's critical. Indeed, for wearable, we don't have the all my machine learning algorithm, I put them on the web, they're on GitHub, they can be used by anyone. I think it's really essential to push people to be completely transparent And I think similarly, the device, we really need the data available for everyone to be able to use, because there's always smarter people than us, ready to do something even more exciting with the data. That's one point. And the second point, which I think is lacking, is a sense of community. I mean, I remember how the circadian field moved forward so incredibly. It was just a few people that just sat down, Joe Takahashi, Michael Rosbar, I mean, like 20 people, and they just decided to just tackle that problem. And they really met regularly, and they really kind of got a global agenda. I think, unfortunately, I'm not sure that we really have that enough in the sleep field.
I wonder whether, Yang, you want to comment on that, because Yang's coming from a neuroscience background in the transformed sleep research.
I feel very strongly that, just coming to this meeting just across the Big Bridge, I felt like I learned so much just over this last 2 days. I didn't even know, all you guys, there are just so many people, right? Just the Bay Area, we have such a concentration of people studying sleep at different levels. But I didn't know you guys, and I feel like, what I do is circuit analysis, and I can benefit so much from just talking to you guys regularly. So I think if we can just something very practical, like starting some kind of regular meeting, just so that we can get together, that would be tremendously helpful.
So sort of related to this community idea, I think that it would be interesting, maybe this already exists and I just don't know about it, but if sort of technologists would spend like 3 months or something in a lab, and because as scientists, we don't really know necessarily what it is that technology can do for us. And the technologists are like, well, we don't really know what this technology can do for scientists. And I think that if we had more communication, but it really takes kind of an embedded approach. You don't, in 3 hours or something, you might not have the idea. It takes time to build it. And I think a lot of the major corporations have maybe a little extra bandwidth to have, send out some of their eager creative people and get them to know a little bit about what's going on in the sort of cutting edge of a field. And then maybe they'll be like, oh, well, this is the problem. This is the device we need. Let's try to make it now. That type of thing.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a quick comment that there is actually a meeting that happens quarterly. It's a multidisciplinary sleep breakfast that's hosted by a group at UCSF. Eric Prather, I don't know if he's still here, but he sends out the announcements about that, and there's usually a speaker every time. I don't know, maybe that could be expanded, and maybe we could get some funding or something to make it a larger conference. And the other quick comment I wanted to say is just in terms of all the new wearables and everything, to me, the validation of those devices has been, in addition to not being able to get the raw data, the validation has been, even with the research grade actigraphs going years back, you just don't know how they compare to each other still, and what about on the waist versus the wrist? So I don't know what we do about that, but it's not too exciting to publish, I think, validation studies, but they're super important.
So I think just to pick up on a couple of the comments, I think one of the challenges is, especially for the startups, is that their VC funding, doesn't want to pay for those clinical trials. So that's one of the things that I think I get a little skeptical of the Kickstarter and things like that, because I know they're going to do whatever they can just to get the market adoption. So I think it really does fall on some of the bigger tech firms, and just to not have bias, I'll talk about Apple instead of Google. I think Apple takes health very seriously, right? And they did a fairly rigorous set of studies with the Apple Watch and heart rate. And I think we can all say we hope that they'll do something in sleep, and they probably are. They made an acquisition in that format. So I do think that it is on the big tech companies, because they can afford it, right? I fund clinical studies, and because I know that if we're going to work on anything, sometimes it's something that I think is just interesting. Sometimes I think it's some tech, but I do think that we have to take some responsibility for that. And then another thing on your idea, I really like it. I don't know. See, I don't even know if that exists. So on our side, it exists. We have a website. We have people apply, and then it's a very turnkey program to bring in master's students or PhD candidates anywhere from 3 months to a year. And so again, pass that around. That's one way to get embedded in our side. I have people that if somebody said, hey, I'm going to open my lab for 3 months at Stanford or Berkeley, I would consider that. There are resources we have that if we had a shared research goal, that would be interesting, and that wouldn't be hard to do, right? So.
Yeah, I would like to comment on this because I have worked with a lot of wearable and so forth, and I really do think that it's still extremely difficult to work with companies. I won't cite any of them because I've worked with all of them. Yeah. They're all difficult, yeah. And I think one of the issues that we have, of course, besides the lawyers, is the fact that often, they don't have the same culture. Like the pharma companies, they have worked for decades with academia. They know what they can get, and they know what they cannot get. So there is a relationship that has been formed for many, many years that makes it possible to work together. It's not optimal, but it works. But right now, tech has not found a really good way to work with academia. The way I see it is often we do a lot of validation. We just validate, we give the data, but they are not interested at all in our intellectual input. I mean, that what they want is just their data, do it themselves. They don't care what I think, and I don't care anymore. I just charge them because that's the only thing that you can do that's useful to use it for something else. Yeah. But I think it's a missed opportunity. But I just, maybe you have some idea on how to change that culturally. But
yeah, well, I think it's open dialogue like this, right? And so I think I've been pretty open with the academics that I work with. That look, you have to tell me what I don't know. It's what you don't know what you don't know. Like there's just so much gaps when people come from cross-disciplinary fields. It sounds great on paper, but I think it does come down to relationships and trust. Right, because if I trust you enough, Emmanuel, to say, hey, I have no idea what this means, and I don't even know what you want out of it, right? Like if I have to sort of guess, and then there has to be a sense of trust to say, look, this is what at least my leadership is expecting us to generate IP. So how are we going to do this, right? Does IP matter to you? Does it not matter? And so I think it's really having an honest conversation in settings like this where we can find out what matters to people, because I think we have the same goal, right? Like, there was plenty of ideas and problem areas that were sketched out over the last day and a half that get me excited, and that obviously you guys are excited or you wouldn't be talking about it. So we have a North Star, but how do we share what's important on that journey to them?
Yeah, but I think what the essence of academy is that we just go whatever direction we want, is that we are just free electrons. And free electrons don't really fit very well in the corporate models. They do bring something. So I think there is a need, and some companies, I think, understand that. So they sometimes just give some kind of support in a way that's very broad and doesn't really is very directed. I'm not saying that, I know it's difficult, but I think there's a little bit of need of that. And trust a little bit the academies that there's a lot of problems with it. They go in all kind of direction, but that at the end, it still brings some good, including to the company that work with them. And often it does happen, but that's just my view.
Maybe also to put maybe another angle on this. So I'm one of the program officers at CZI. The area that I lead is neurodegenerative disease, but we fund in other areas. And a common need from the academic community that they come to CZI for, which I think they think that we can solve this, is around data science, computational biology, and tech. And so there is a bottleneck in the academic community. I mean, there's not a bottleneck for ideas and for great science, but I think there's a capacity and a workforce bottleneck around data science, bioinformatics, everything from people who can handle the data and manage it to people who can interpret it. And in that way, I think it's maybe a little bit different than I work with you in between, well, I'm not in the lab either, but Emmanuel works with you on a specific scientific project and you negotiate IP and intellectual exchange. And more, you guys also benefit from academia and kind of the data scientists who are trained as PhDs in neuroscience. I think Yang can speak to this, who then move into tech with kind of a scientific perspective, but also good training in data science. Is there more of that we can figure out how to kind of bring the loop back? It's a huge bottleneck, I think, in almost all fields. I mean, really looking at you, Matt, you can pipe in here. If we think about not just sleep, but all these issues as big data problems in academia, we really don't have kind of the personnel capacity and expertise to efficiently make opportunities out of this data. And those opportunities, I think, could then be opportunities for whether it's translational applications, therapies, or consumer tech products. But I'm wondering whether other academics here can speak to maybe that bottleneck as it plays out in their worlds and institutions. I think it's good for private sector to see this.
Absolutely, especially here in the Bay Area. Any of my PhD students that are getting into computational neuroscience, we lose our PhD students, master students to you guys, and we can't compete with your wages, right? And so this is a serious problem for Bay Area institutions, just what Katja said, that the brain drain goes straight to tech, and it'd be really nice if there was a way that there was some reciprocation.
Well, I think also having trained people who bring that data lens and that tech lens within academia could allow kind of more of a delivery of opportunities towards tech. So it's, not just quite pay us back for the effort we put in, but we can kind of mutually benefit more if there were more of a closed circle.
I don't want to put him on the spot, poor guy. But it's true that, for example, the event resources that Google has, I mean, I know that at MIT, Brandon Westover, he has a big grant. He has been provided with free resources for 6 months for all the clusters and, for doing machine learning, which are extremely expensive when you try to run some of these models. And so there are other ways that even tech could facilitate some of this. But I really don't want to put you on the spot because you're the only guy that represented. So,
One thing I will say, though, and I don't even, maybe you've applied to this, but do people know that Google Research reviews grants, and that it's not directive at all? In fact, I just reviewed one, and it was for a researcher from Georgia Tech, and so you can apply and just say what it is, and then it is sort of free money. So in that way, we do try to seed different activities, and so if that's of interest, I can get the URL, make it really super easy, and would love for you guys just to apply. And then obviously I'll be a reviewer because they'll say, oh, this is sleep. Who at Alphabet knows anything about sleep? So that's one way to, I think, encourage something that's not as directive, hands-on. So if you haven't explored that, that's worth exploring.
I just wanted to come back to Noelle's point about the brain drain, and I get that, it's a problem. But I heard something interesting recently, a friend who's a chief medical officer for a genomics company who said they're getting great bioinformatics and statistical genetics types of people coming from Google because they're people who don't want to be in this huge corporate monster. And so as in so many things with academia, the best people and the most successful people are the people who want to be there because they really care deeply about the problem, not about how big their salary is. And so I don't disagree with you that it's a problem, but we also have something to offer in terms of these very interesting and special
pain and suffering
questions that we get to address.
Yeah, I mean, just to, I think, add on to that, I mean, we have the same thing. Our lab is basically a pipeline to data science for the kinds of training that our students get and some postdocs as well. And I think it really does kind of come back down to there's this incompatibility in the culture between industry and academia in terms of the incentives, in terms of what people are actually looking to get out of it. And I know that there are, I mean, this is anecdotal, but a lot of people I talk to who go into data science end up kind of unsatisfied because they don't have an intellectual independence. They feel like ultimately they're selling ads. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but so I think if there's a way to encourage the industry side to be a little bit more willing to explore and take risks on some of these particularly like risky scientific questions, then there's just a much more sort of bidirectional conduit between these two areas that might open up.
So just not to try to monopolize this, but one reciprocation I was thinking of that was a little different was computational time. We really do need, and it's very expensive. That there are things that Google could provide for us that would benefit us, that would benefit us in terms of like server time. That sort of hard stuff would also be beneficial. I mean, and we can't compete with the salaries, but we really could use your deep learning platforms, right, at an earlier stage. We really could use all of that technology. So, I'm not trying to like pick you out, but anyway.
No, thank you for the feedback.
Yeah. And up the front there.
So,
We'll pivot.
as technology advances, I think that the medical community, especially physicians, we're kind of tasked with trying to solve a patient's problem that was discovered through technology. But so, for example, I'm going to get a patient who comes in and go, oh, my watch is saying that I keep waking up, or, I'm not sleeping enough. What do I do? The first question that is the patient's concern valid? And I don't know, right? I don't know how valid it is, what their watch or whatever has recorded. And so I'm tasked with trying to help them with a problem that I don't know exists. So, or how serious, the severity of it. And so there's a complete disconnect. And we're at the front lines of trying to address the problem.
Great point. I want to pivot a little bit to moving it maybe from technology with the big T tech to kind of technology on the other side. I mean, that nice slide that Emmanuel has is a convergence of multiple technological revolutions. And the area that I think would be worth talking about is, the awesome power of genetics to kind of point us in a direction, but the incredible difficulty of still getting from whether it's GWAS or Mendelian genetics to an actual biological mechanism. And it strikes me that in a lot of the talks, and I know there's more high throughput ways of assessing this and maybe less complicated areas, that it's still a lot about, well, then we made a mouse of this one gene. And yet we spent the rest of the meeting talking about how complex the physiology of sleep is, how intersecting it is with body systems, with age, with developmental status, with environment, with other triggers. So this is I think, big question in the kind of genes to biology category that goes beyond sleep. But how are we going to get more efficient ways of getting from the genes to really understanding the biology and the mechanism? And I'm going to go to Richa first. And then you.
No, I think there too, there is a revolution going on in, data generation at the cellular level that we know, for example, with the single cell and analyses, both in the natural and perturbed contexts and so on. And so there is, again, this huge need and development of tools to integrate very large data sets and do things in a high throughput manner such that, biology itself is not serial, but is parallel and is systems versus one linear. And so I think that itself is an analytic explosion as well as techniques. And so what the human genomics community is doing a lot of is integrating very disparate data sets and including, and these are getting finer and finer, including things like what you were doing with specific manipulations. And so I think enabling, at least in the sleep field, what I see is really missing is that, yes, there are some large-scale data sets that are out there that are based on biology and perturbation and responses either in sleep or to organ systems across model organisms. But those data, integrating those, especially in sleep, would be extremely valuable in learning, in going from genetics to biology. And to me, in fact, it provides an opportunity that's quite unique in a sense to sleep because of the deep conservation, because of the systemic properties that, and the history of excellent research in this field where, you know, a lot of screens have been done, but those data sets are just not yet integrated. And so this idea of community coming together where it's not really, you know, sleep researcher versus sleep researcher, but sleep researcher finally, you know, knowing that, you know, obviously knowing that how important sleep is to the whole organism in both developmental health and disease states, but that, you know, we need to come together with that phenotyping with all the collective expertise of both the cause, the biomarker, and the consequence that sleep is, and integrate that. And so in some sense, to me, it's about the interface of the basic discovery of, say, you know, the genetics as providing a sort of one causal direction into it, but of then integrating all these, you know, natural and perturbed conditions to go towards sleep and its integration with disease. So in some sense, I think it's really a community-wide effort, and what we're doing that, you know, these large-scale data sets allow us to do, which, you know, we've started with one biobank, but, you know, now there's a platform of 10 biobanks with data starting from the, you know, genetics, multiple layers of omics, multiple wearables, multiple series of measurements going to disease, health records, and longitudinal analyses. And all of that, I think, is useful. But then in the context of sleep, having researchers being open is important.
I'm a little biased too, in the sense that I really believe that the more data you have, the more smart people can find creative ways of analyzing it. I know, like, for example, I know Anna looks at transcription factors and how they could coordinate groups of genes that have been found, you know. Well, you have Jonathan Pritchard, I think, is very interested in how different genes may interact epistatically through expression or things like that. I think when we start to get this bigger and bigger data set, and we have way smarter people than me, start to look at them, you know, there is some functional data that can emerge. And also, of course, you have allelic series, so you can start to look at knockouts in a human, because at the end, if you have a large number of people who are sequenced, you find people who have a defect in certain genes. So I think I totally agree that I think we really need this data set to be all available. And for example, what you said is true. There is not enough data of like perturbation, sleep deprivation, what happened to the body, could it be like available to everyone? Circadian patterns with all the proteins could be available to everyone. So like people really can make sense of things from many, many directions. And ideally, we just want to sit in front of a computer and don't do experiments anymore. But of course, maybe that's not possible.
That's keeping that from happening. I mean, I have some ideas, but what would it take to make that happen?
You can answer.
You're allowed to say money, but not just money.
No, I think large resources, for example, I think, of course, I argue that I think we needed at least a data set that contains, you know, the phenotype superficially, and then the phenotype deeper with some real sleep studies, so that we can measure sleep, not just like if people feel tired subjectively, which is very contaminated, and then proteomics and genetics. And, but of course, we also need animal models and to test some of those hypotheses that still cannot be tested through direct genetics in humans. But
well, I've had long discussions and arguments with Richa and Emmanuel. You know, I'm leaning much more strongly to Mendelian genetics, because there we have successfully, you know, shown causal relationships, which is a real challenge with complex genetics and at a much greater cost in terms of resources. But sleep is sort of where Alzheimer's and Parkinson's was 30 or 40 years ago. And everyone said, oh, those rare familial Alzheimer families, you know, they're rare. You know, this isn't going to have anything to do with bread and butter Alzheimer's disease. or Parkinson's disease or whatever. The reality is that thousands of labs around the world are working on genes discovered in rare Mendelian families. And so, my own bias is that if we can identify single genes and variants and study them, that's just a single, one mutation, one gene. But as you identify more and more genes, they will elucidate a pathway, and many of the genes that have been shown to cause Mendelian diseases have also been shown to cause or to contribute to risk in complex genetic diseases of the same type. So.
Yes, I would agree also. I think they're complementary and they're really important too. And in a lot of the large-scale cohorts, one can, since we're getting to millions of people, one can identify single gene mutations of strong effect that will be very important for revealing biology. And I think both, the spectrum of alleles will be important, and it's definitely there's a place for both. Yeah.
So I was going to let you say something, but I was going to pick on you anyway. I think the angle of question that I think comes next is, yes, I think both Mendelian, GWAS, complex genetics are important, but how do we accelerate getting from those genes and pathways to actually an understanding of biology? And you've got something to say on that.
So speaking of the awesome power of genetics, some of us have spent decades cloning genes in yeast, Arabidopsis, zebrafish, mouse. And what we've seen is just like we've got MACE1, PER3, hypocretin receptor. I believe all those genes were cloned not through human studies. And I really appreciate what Richa and Julian showed. You need to go down to animal model to demonstrate that it's causal, that it's a gene, that it's the enhancer. Just like to use locus. I used to teach quantitative genetics 20 years ago. This is what I would use, QTL and whatever. That means you don't know where you are, or you have a region, and maybe the SNPs, we always think about cis regulation. There is also trans regulation. So what it takes to do the biology. Pick a locus, do the bio. It's nice to accumulate, to say, oh, now we have those regions, and and it actually does bias the community, because in those papers you've got genes that are cited, and everybody thinks that those genes, because they are associated, are the cause. Now we need to just reinforce this pipeline of you do really well at what you do, and you're like, oh, I need people to support the next step, because to pick a gene, some people do an entire career. I know an old professor who did analysis of CROX20 for 50 years. It's just and you can do that. So it takes time and work, but we need a faster pipeline. And now with CRISPR-Cas9, we should be able with Drosophila, zebrafish, CLX, whatever works. And I understand that some genes, especially the immune system, is really not, the best example, but for a lot of them, MACE, homeotic genes, hypocretin, we got it through, vertebrate. So we need to have a more streamlined work in this community to make the functional data supporting the medical observation.
Totally agree.
Yes, this screen needs, and the data for this screen, this Casper9 screen and so forth, should be made available. And I think some people are trying, even at the UK, they are trying to do that. I can't remember the mouse phenome. Clearly we need more and more, this is very complementary.
I don't think we need more data. I think we already have enough loci to get started. And like Louis said, we used to do a suppressor screen. You've got a gene and then you find the interactor by epistase and whatever. Once you have, your finger in the system, usually it's easier to unfold the pathway or whatever. I've been doing this for 30 years. Computation, when it comes to genetics and genomics nowadays, it's just there is so much, 3% of the genome is coding. The primary sequence, we fail to understand the regulatory code. It's not the ATGC, it's most likely at the epigenetic level. Hypocretin is a great example, actually, because you take the zebrafish promoter, 2 kb, you take the mouse promoter, 2 kb, you align them. There is not one single base pair that will align. Still, they will fix the same transcription factors and whatever. So the primary sequence of DNA is not always the answer.
So there's one thing I just wanted to add, which is that I think the key thing is once we have, so we use the human genetics to find which genes, when perturbed, are actually important for the phenotype. And then it's really that I think the model organism community can then take those particular genes or even screen a series of genes that are within those regions of association, identify how they're working to influence the phenotype, and you're right, then it is really about understanding the biology in the model organism for sleep.
But the problem is that, for the hundreds of associations for prostate cancer and for, sleep chronotype and so forth, it's not the case that there are labs out there that are just going to pick each one up and say, oh, I'm going to follow that one, I'm going to follow that one. It really requires people. Part of the problem with big data is that a lot of these folks are statisticians who don't really care about biology. I think Richa is a prime example of someone who is not that, and I think that's great. But we need people who really, as Philippe says, really are committed to following it into understanding biology, not waiting around for you guys to pick up this locus or that locus or this one and do the really hard work of testing whether it's biologically relevant or what's biologically relevant.
A little bit it comes back to, less a science issue and more of a culture collaboration issue. I'm going to let Emmanuel have the second to last word, and then I'll have the last word because I know the time is running out.
I do believe that, for example, hypocretin is not just one gene. We have seen the complexity of this single peptide in terms of what it's doing physiologically and so forth. So obviously, not everything is genetics, but I think the beauty of genetics is it's an unbiased screen, and then you get a menu of things you can start to look at. It's just a basis. Right now, it's just that finding genes is easy. That's the only thing. It's just, it's a low-hanging fruit, But you're right, the biology is the next phase, and it's huge, but it's going to take a lot of time and a lot of smart people and a lot of one by one really thinking carefully about each problem. And that's what we have to do as well, yeah.
So as a rapid fire close, you guys are going to do not quite the rapid fire talks, but thinking about this vision of a sleep field or a world that's more integrative, collaborative, open, that is able to bridge between these very disparate subdisciplines. Kind of from your perspective in your worlds, I'm channeling Corey because she often asks this question in our workshops. What's the one thing, think big, that you think the field could collectively do that would make a difference towards getting to that vision? I'll start with you, Emmanuel.
I wanted to be last, but one thing, as I said, I think there's two things probably is resources, large resource with objectively sleep recorded data, genomics and metabolomics, etc. That is really bridging a gap that's missing right now, and probably more animal models and more basic research, These are the two things that I think are really
great.
Missing.
Yang. Go rapid fire because I think
I agree that resources is very important. The second thing is what I said already. I think that communication is very important. Just at this meeting, I met Julian and met you, and we already realized that there are some things that we can work together. And so that's really, it's going to benefit my research.
Perfect. We could put resources as the one thing everyone's going to say. So everything other than resources.
Sure. For me too, I think it's really about breaking the silos so that we recognize that we're all after the same things, and we have our specific line of expertise. We need to reach across and learn from the others, as well as recognize that we don't know so much of the other part. So coming together,
perfect.
It's very important.
Yeah, plus one to that, showing up. I think people making the effort to be here, even myself, I think I'm touched. I see Dr. Bill Dement in the front row, and I think about the effort, Dr. Dement, that you go through. Even at this stage, your passion, continues to be here. It's inspiring, and because I'll be honest, I had thoughts of like, the next one of these, do I, should I really do this? Sometimes I feel like I'm out of sorts with hanging out, but no. we need to show up. We need to have more of these. We need to have more representation from the various disciplines to really make progress together. So,
I agree with everything that's been said, but especially with Richa, that we need more people who are truly crossing disciplines and understanding different aspects of aspects of different silos, and more interaction between people in different silos, and it all comes down to resources. Yeah. Because in times of funding as these, people are circling their wagons, and the Drosophila people don't want to fund human research, and some people doing human research say, well, it's an invertebrate, why should we do that? And so, but I think it is, whatever we can do to help interactions, communication, and individuals who are crossing into different silos and trying to integrate these different approaches to solving what is a very, very complex problem.